My grandfather tried it once. Mixed oats into the south field, the low ground near the creek where the water sat longest after a hard rain. He failed, wrote 3 words in his leather notebook and never tried again. Right idea, wrong knowledge. 60 years later, his granddaughter read those 3 words and understood something he never got the chance to finish. That notebook has been in this family since 1923. My father kept it in the wooden box on the bottom shelf of the old oak desk in the corner of the living room, the same desk his father had kept it in before him. I never opened it until the summer my daughter came home and changed everything. My name is Walt Holden. I have farmed 480 acres in Calhoun County, Iowa for 31 years. My father Raymond farmed this same ground before me, and his father Earl farmed it before Raymond. And Earl started clearing this land in 1923 with a team of horses and a borrowed plow and the kind of stubbornness that does not have a polite name. 3 generations of the same soil. 3 generations of the same creek running along the south edge of the property where the ground dips and pools in wet springs. 3 generations of winter wheat planted in October and harvested in July and then planted again the following year, because that is what this land grew. And that is what this county knew how to do with it. I'm going to tell you about the summer of 2019 because that is when everything changed. I'm going to tell you about a letter I kept hidden in that oak desk drawer for 3 years, underneath Earl's notebook, because I was ashamed of it and because I did not want my wife or my daughter to know how close we were to losing everything we had built across 100 years of work. But before I tell you about the letter, I need to tell you about the land, because the land is the reason the letter mattered. And before I tell you about the land, I need to tell you about Earl. Earl Holden came to Calhoun County in 1921 with $42, a wool coat, and a wife named Margaret who was 6 months pregnant with what would become my father Raymond. Earl had worked in the stockyards in Omaha for 4 years saving that $42, and he had decided that working for someone else was a form of dying slowly, and he preferred to die quickly on his own ground if it came to that. He found 480 acres of mixed grassland and river bottom on the east side of the county, and he made an arrangement with the landowner that took him 7 years to satisfy in full. He broke ground in the spring of 1923. He planted winter wheat for the first time that October. The notebook started that same year. It is not a beautiful document. Earl was a practical man, and he wrote without decoration, in short sentences that recorded what he did and what happened and what he concluded from the difference between the two. Yields by field block, rainfall by month, equipment failures and the cost of repair, prices at the Rockwell City elevator and whether they were fair or whether they were the kind of prices that made a man want to put his fist through a wall. On page 37 of that notebook, written in pencil in Earl's careful block letters, is an entry dated October of 1931. He had tried something that fall. He had seeded a portion of the south field, the low ground near the creek, with a mixture of winter wheat and oats. He does not explain in the entry why he thought to do it. He records that the stand established well, that the oats came up faster than the wheat, that the early season structure of the field looked different from the pure wheat ground around it. Then he records that he made an error in the seeding rate, that the oat component crowded the wheat during grain fill, and that the yield on that portion came in below his pure wheat average. He tried it once and it didn't work, and he wrote 3 words in the margin of that entry, and he never tried it again. Right idea, wrong knowledge. I did not know those 3 words existed until June of 2019. My daughter found them. Her name is Sadie. She was 21 years old that summer, between her 2nd and 3rd year at Iowa State University in Ames, studying agronomy. And she arrived in late May with a duffel bag and a manila folder full of printed research papers and the particular restless energy that belongs to young people who have just spent a year learning things that feel urgent and have not yet had the chance to use them. Sadie had grown up on this farm. She had driven the grain cart at 12 and pulled soil samples at 14 and spent the summer before college working for a seed company in Rockwell City, learning which hybrids performed in which soil types. She was not naive about farming. She had her hands in this ground before she could read. But 3 years at Iowa State had done something to the architecture of how she thought, had given her a framework for asking why in a way that farming families do not always teach. Because farming families teach by doing, and there's not always time in the doing to stop and ask why it has always been done that particular way. She came home in late May and was polite about it for about a week, and then asked if she could look through the desk. I told her she could look through anything she wanted except the top left drawer. Yeah. She did not ask me why. She knew from my tone that it was not a question with a comfortable answer. She went through the desk looking for the farm records I had mentioned, the old yield maps and soil surveys going back to the 1970s. She found Earl's notebook on her third day of looking, in the wooden box on the bottom shelf where Raymond had placed it sometime in the early 1960s. She read it cover to cover, sitting at the desk in the living room. I did not know she had found it until she knocked on the barn door that afternoon while I was working on the planter. She said, "Papa, did you know your grandfather tried oats in the South Field?" I straightened up and looked at her. I told her I did not know that. Oh. She had the notebook in her hand, page 37, marked with a strip of paper torn from the edge of one of her printed articles. She held it out to me, and I read the entry, and I read the 3 words in the margin, and I stood there for a long moment holding my grandfather's notebook in the middle of my own barn and feeling something that I did not have an easy name for. Pride is not quite right. Recognition is closer. She said, "I've been reading about this. There is research out of Iowa State and out of a university in the Netherlands. Mixed winter wheat and oat stands. The oats establish faster and they create a physical support structure for the wheat during grain fill. When the stems get heavy and wet, the oats hold them. It reduces lodging significantly. The trial data shows a 34% reduction in lodging incidents compared to pure wheat stands." I handed the notebook back to her. I asked what lodging cost in practical terms. She said, "In a bad year, between 15 and 40% of yield, plus quality discounts at the elevator for grain that touched the ground. The net revenue loss per acre can reach $60 or $70. In wind event seasons, the mixed stands outperformed pure wheat by an average of $47 per acre across 3 seasons of trials." I had farmed this ground for 31 years, and I understood what she was telling me. I also understood that I had never seen anyone in Calhoun County plant oats alongside their wheat, and there was a weight to that fact that did not dissolve easily in the presence of a university folder. I told her I needed to think about it. She said, "I know, take your time, but Grandpa Earl was right. He just did not have the seeding rate data." I thought about it for 6 days. On the 7th day, I opened the top left drawer of the oak desk. The letter was there where I had placed it in November of 2018, folded in thirds, and tucked into a plain white envelope with the name of the bank printed in the upper left corner. I had not read it since the day it arrived. I did not need to read it again. I knew what it said. $280,000 outstanding on the combine loan. Final payment due December 2022. 3 years and 1 month from the day I sat with it at that desk and could not bring myself to tell June what I had done. The combine had been necessary. I want to be clear about that because a man who carries that kind of debt in silence owes an explanation. The old machine had given out in the summer of 2017, the same summer June had her heart episode. And I had spent most of that fall choosing between bad options and had chosen the one that seemed least damaging at the time. The bank had reasonable terms. The 2018 harvest was decent. I told myself the next 2 seasons would close the gap, and I would refinance before the final payment date without anyone needing to know how close the margin was running. I put the letter back in the drawer. I walked out to the south field and stood at the edge of the low ground near the creek and looked at the 30 acres that had been my worst performing block for the last 6 years. The soil there was good, dark and heavy, but it ran wet in the spring, and the wheat on that ground went down more often than anywhere else on the farm. I walked back to the house and sat at the kitchen table. June was at the counter. Sadie was across from me with her folder and her legal pad covered in pencil figures. I said 30 acres. The south field by the creek. If the yields come in wrong, we talk before you do anything else. Sadie looked at the folder, then at me. She said, "That is fair." June set a cup of coffee on the table between us, without being asked, and went back to the counter and said nothing. But she put her hand on my shoulder for a moment as she passed, and that was enough. So, now I need to tell you about Roy Briggs because you cannot understand what happened at the co-op in May of 2019 without understanding the kind of man Roy was. And you cannot understand Roy without understanding what 19 years in the same county extension office does to a person's sense of what is possible. Roy had a bachelor's degree in agronomy from Iowa State and a master's in extension education from the University of Wisconsin, and he had come to Calhoun County in the year 2000 with the intention of staying 3 years and building his resume. He had stayed 19 because the county had absorbed him the way good soil takes in water, slowly and completely, until he could not imagine himself anywhere else. He knew every farm by its soil type and drainage pattern and rotation history. He knew which families had money trouble and which had equipment trouble, and which had the kind of trouble that comes from a father and a son who cannot agree on how a farm should be run. He was not a bad man. Roy Briggs was thorough and consistent and genuinely committed to the welfare of the farmers he served. But 19 years in one place had calcified the borders of what he considered worth considering. He had built his understanding of what worked on the evidence of 19 seasons in Calhoun County, and that evidence did not include mixed wheat oat stands, and he saw no reason to look beyond the borders of his own experience for guidance his experience had not suggested was needed. That is not a criticism of Roy. That is a description of how certainty hardens. It does not feel like stubbornness from the inside. It feels like knowledge earned in the field. The difference between knowledge and assumption is very hard to locate when you have never been forced to find it. Sadie went into the Calhoun County Co-op on a Tuesday morning in late May to pick up a soil amendment I had asked her to get. Roy was at the counter with two farmers who had been working ground in this county for longer than Sadie had been alive. Gene Whitmore and Bud Carver, both of whom had opinions about most things and were not reluctant to share them. Cooper Vance was in the back of the store loading bags of fertilizer onto a flatbed cart. Young enough to still be invisible to men like Roy and Bud and Gene, but old enough to be paying attention. Roy asked how I was doing. Sadie told him fine. He asked if she was back for the summer. She said just a few weeks before her senior year started. He said that was too bad. The county could use more young people who knew which end of a tractor to point at a field. It was the kind of compliment older men give to young women in agricultural communities, warm and condescending in equal measure, and she accepted it the way she had learned to accept such things, with a nod and nothing behind it. Then she mentioned, without making a production of it, that she was going to be putting in a mixed winter wheat and oat stand on 30 acres of the south field before she went back to Ames. The silence lasted about 2 seconds. Roy started laughing, not meanly. That would have been easier to hold on to afterward. He laughed the way a person laughs when they have heard something so far outside their frame of reference that amusement is the only available response. Bud Carver smiled. Gene Whitmore looked at his work boots. Roy said, "Mixed stand." He said it the way you say words that belong to a different language. He said, "Honey, this is a wheat county. Has been since before your grandfather was born. You put oats in with your wheat. You are going to confuse your combine operator, cut your yield, and spend harvest explaining yourself to your father." Sadie cited the trial data, 34% reduction in lodging, $47 per acre advantage in wind event seasons. Roy said, "Trials." He invested the word with a particular weight that made clear he considered data collected on university research plots to be a separate and lesser category of information than knowledge accumulated by walking actual farm ground across nearly 2 decades. He said, "You know what I have never seen in 19 years? A Calhoun County farmer who needed oats to hold up his wheat. Your father is a good farmer. Go plant his wheat. Let the oats go." Bud Carver nodded. Gene Whitmore continued to study his boots. In the back of the store, Cooper stacked the last bag of fertilizer onto the cart and did not say anything, but he did not laugh either. Sadie said she appreciated the advice. She picked up the soil amendment and walked out. What Roy did not know, and what she did not tell him, was that her great-grandfather had written 3 words about this exact idea in a notebook in 1931, that the Holden Southfield had been trying to teach this lesson for nearly 90 years. That the university data Roy was dismissing as theory was the explanation for something Earl had felt in his hands and had not had the science to complete. What Roy also did not know was that Gerald Mercer had been to the farm 3 weeks earlier. Mercer drove a gray company SUV and wore boots that had never seen mud, and he came to the farm on a Tuesday afternoon in early May with a plain white envelope and the particular confidence that belongs to men who have made the same offer enough times to know that most people eventually say yes. He introduced himself as the regional director for Apex AgriCorp, a land acquisition division based out of Des Moines. His company had been building a portfolio of agricultural land in central Iowa, and the Holden Farm was a property they had identified as a strong fit for their long-term operational model. The offer inside the envelope was $2,100,000 for the full 480 acres. A clean transaction, 30-day close, no contingencies. He said it pleasantly, the way a man delivers a line he has delivered before and expects to work again. I took the envelope. I held it for a moment. I thought about the letter in the oak desk drawer, the one with the bank's name in the upper left corner and the number 280,000 printed inside it. I thought about Earl clearing this ground in 1923 with a borrowed plow. I thought about Raymond sitting at that same desk in 1961, signing papers that put this land in his name, and the look on his face in the photograph my mother had kept on the mantel until she died. I handed the envelope back to Mercer without opening it. He did not seem surprised. He said, "Take your time. The offer stands through the end of the year. Markets change, Mr. Holden. Circumstances change." He drove away in the gray SUV. I stood in the gravel and watched him go. There was something in the phrasing "circumstances change" that was not quite a threat and not quite a prediction, but occupied the space between the two like something left on a doorstep that you did not order. I did not tell Sadie about Mercer's visit. I did not tell June. I went back into the barn and finished the work I had been doing on the planter, and thought about what it meant that a man with clean boots and a company envelope had driven 40 miles to put a number on my grandfather's land. The South Field got planted in the first week of October 2019, 30 acres of mixed winter wheat and oats, seeded at the rates Sadie had worked out with her professor in Ames before she went back for her senior year. The rest of the farm, 450 acres, went in as pure winter wheat, the way Raymond had planted it, and Earl had planted it, and every other farm in Calhoun County planted it. I didn't tell anyone at the co-op what I had done. I was not embarrassed exactly. But I was also not prepared to stand at that counter and have Roy find new ways to be kind about it. The wheat went in the ground, and the ground went quiet the way it does in October when the season is over, and what happens next is no longer in your hands. The first frost came in late October. November brought the kind of gray that settles over Iowa like a second sky, low and without drama. In the second week of November, Mercer came back. He did not knock this time. He pulled into the gravel drive and stood beside his vehicle until I came out of the barn. His company had reviewed the property again and wanted to revise the offer upward. $2,400,000. He said the additional $300,000 reflected their updated assessment of the soil quality on the east blocks. I stood in the November cold in my work jacket and looked at him across the gravel and said the offer was not something I was interested in. He said he understood. He said markets were unpredictable and that the next 2 or 3 growing seasons were going to be difficult for a lot of producers in central Iowa. That input costs were rising and elevator prices were volatile, and that some farms in the county were going to find themselves in positions that were hard to recover from. He said he hoped the Holden operation would not be one of them. He said it with what sounded like genuine concern. He left. I went inside. June was at the counter in the kitchen. She did not ask who the visitor had been. I sat at the table and looked out the window and thought about 30 acres of mixed grain sitting under the first freeze of the year in the South Field, and about a notebook from 1923 that had waited 96 years for someone to finish what it started. The winter came down over Calhoun County without asking permission. The wheat went dormant under the snow. Men serviced their equipment and watched commodity prices and talked at the co-op about whether the spring would be wet or dry. Roy held his informal session at the co-op the second Tuesday of December, the way he always did. I was not there. I had too much to do in the shop and too little interest in standing at a counter, pretending the conversation in May had not happened. Cooper Vance was there. He said nothing about the Holden farm. He was not yet the kind of man who said things in rooms full of older men who had decided they already knew what mattered. In March, the wheat broke dormancy. In April, Sadie called from Ames and asked how the South Field was looking. I told her I had not walked it yet. She described what the oat plants should look like at that stage of development. I wrote it down on the back of an envelope. Odd. In May, I walked the South Field for the first time since planting. The stand was different from the pure wheat fields. The texture was not the same. The oat plants grew in between the wheat stems at a slightly different height and angle, and the whole field had an interlocked quality that the fields around it did not have. I stood at the edge for a long time. Then I called her. I said, "It looks the way you said it would look." She said, "That is good." "Papa, that is exactly right." I stood in the May afternoon with the phone in my hand and the South Field in front of me and the oak desk inside the house with its letter and its notebook sharing the same drawer. And I didn't say anything else because there was nothing I could say easily that was equal to what I was thinking. I said, "I will keep an eye on it." She said, I know you will. We hung up. The spring moved into summer. The wheat grew tall and heavy the way good wheat does in a season with adequate rain and no late frost. The south field grew differently, the mixed stand filling in with that interlocking structure, the oat plants and the wheat stems learning to lean slightly toward each other, creating something that held itself upright through its own interdependence. June watched me from the kitchen window some evenings when I came in from the fields. She had learned across 31 years of marriage to read the difference between the walk I had when the farm was running as it should and the walk I had when it was not. She did not ask which one this was. She waited. In the last week of September, with harvest 2 weeks away, Mercer called. His company's offer remained available, but the window for the current terms would close at the end of the calendar year. He wanted to make sure I had the information I needed to make a good decision for my family. I thanked him for calling. I ended the call. I went back out to the barn. 10 days later, the weather changed, and the forecast on the evening of October 13th called for winds of 15 to 20 miles per hour with a chance of gusts to 25. A routine October system, nothing that would keep a farmer awake. I went to bed at 10. June was already asleep. At 11 o'clock, I woke to a sound I had heard before and did not need to look at a window to identify. The wind had arrived and it had not read the forecast. It was hitting the north side of the house in sustained waves, not gusting and dropping but pushing continuously, the way wind pushes when it has made a decision. I got up and went to the window. The trees along the north fence line were bent hard to the south. The yard light at the corner of the barn swung in long arcs. The sky had the pale darkness of a sky moving very fast overhead. I stood at the window for a long time. There was nothing to do. The wheat was in the field. The decisions had been made. All that remained was to find out what the morning would show. I went back to bed. I did not sleep. June put her hand on my arm in the dark, and we lay there listening to the wind work against the house, and I thought about 450 acres of pure wheat on long stems softened by 3 weeks of wet weather, and about 30 acres of mixed grain in the south field near the creek, and about 3 words written in a margin in 1931 by a man who knew he was right and did not know how to finish it. The storm ran from 11 at night until 3 in the morning. 40 miles per hour sustained, gusts to 53, 4 hours of pressure applied to heavy-headed stems at the worst possible moment in the growing cycle. At 4 in the morning I got dressed. June was awake. I told her I was going to go look. She said she knew. I drove north first, to the largest blocks of pure wheat. I pulled the truck to the end of the first field and turned the headlights across it. The crop had gone down. Not in the low spots, not in the wind-exposed corners, across the entire field, stems bent at the base, heads lying south in the direction the wind had come from. 200 acres flattened as though something enormous had pressed its hand across the top of it and dragged, and I sat in the truck and looked at it and felt the specific cold weight of a man who has watched a year's work come undone in 4 hours. Then I drove to the south field. I parked at the edge and got out and stood in the early morning dark. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east, barely enough to make out shapes. The corners of the field near the tree line had gone down, the wind concentrating where it always concentrates near vertical obstacles. But the body of the field, the center 22 acres where the stand was densest and the oat plants most evenly distributed, was standing, not perfectly upright. The wheat stems were leaning, but they were leaning into the oat plants, and the oat plants were holding them. The interlocked structure Sadie had described from the research was doing exactly what the research said it would do. The field had been through the same storm as every other field in Calhoun County. It looked like a field that had endured. The rest of the farm looked like a field that had surrendered. I stood at the edge of those 30 acres as the light came gray and cold over the east side of the county, and I thought about what it cost Earl to write those 3 words and close the book. About what it meant that his great-granddaughter had come home with what he was missing. I drove back to the house. June was at the kitchen table. She looked at me when I came in. I sat down across from her and she waited. I said, "The south field held." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she got up and brought the coffee to the table and sat back down. We didn't say anything else for a while. There was not much else to say. The south field held and the rest of the farm was on the ground, and the combine note was due in 3 years, and Gerald Mercer was going to make another offer before the snow came, and Roy Briggs would hold his December session at the co-op the second Tuesday of the month, the way he always did. But the south field held, And that was the beginning. Some things you do not celebrate. You absorb them. You carry them back into the house, and you sit with them the way you sit with anything that cost you something to learn, quietly, without making it larger than it is, because the work is not finished and the season is not over, and there are still 450 acres of lodged wheat on the ground that need to come in before the next rain arrives. That is what the morning after a storm looks like on a working farm. Not triumph, not vindication, just the next thing that needs doing, and a knowledge held privately that something has shifted in a way you do not yet have words for. The harvest that fall was the hardest I had put in since the early years. The combine moved through the lodged fields at reduced speed, the header angled low to pick up stems lying nearly flat, the grain coming in wet and heavy and already showing early signs of mold in the worst sections where the heads had been in contact with the soil for 4 days before I could get the machine in. The elevator in Rockwell City ran quality checks on every load, and the discounts came back the way I had expected. Not devastating individually, but accumulating across 450 acres into a number that sat at the back of my mind through every hour of those 2 weeks like a stone in a boot. The south field came in last. 30 acres of mixed wheat and oats that required a different header setting and a slower ground speed, and the patience to let the machine work through a stand, unlike anything it had processed in 31 years of harvests on this farm. The combine operator, a man named Les Pruitt, who had run equipment for 3 farms in the county for 20 years, stopped the machine twice in the first pass and got out to look at what he was dealing with. The second time he got out, he stood at the edge of the standing grain and looked at it for a long moment, and then looked at me where I was parked on the field road and did not say anything, but nodded once in a way that meant he understood what he was looking at, even if he could not have explained the science behind it. The wheat on the south field came in at 38 bushels per acre. The oats came in at 22. I sold the oats to a specialty grain buyer in Cedar Rapids who was supplying a regional milling operation and paid a premium the elevator in Rockwell City did not offer, because no one in Calhoun County had grown oats in any meaningful volume for the better part of 2 decades. The blended revenue per acre for those 30 acres came to $194. The pure wheat ground, 450 acres of it, came in at 31 bushels per acre net of quality discounts, translating to $112 per acre against a 5-year average of $187, $75 per acre below baseline, across 450 acres. The number came to $33,750 that did not exist in any account I held. I did the arithmetic at the kitchen table on a Saturday evening in late November with the harvest record spread in front of me and a cup of coffee that went cold before I was halfway through the calculation. June was in the next room. I did not call her in. I sat with the numbers and looked at what they meant against the combine note and the 3 years remaining on it. The south field had earned $82 per acre more than the pure wheat ground. Across 30 acres, that was $2,460 in additional revenue that would not have existed if I had listened to Roy at the co-op in May. It was not a large number. It did not solve the problem of the combine note. But it was the difference between a payment made in full and a conversation with the bank about restructuring. And I had learned enough in 31 years to know that conversations about restructuring rarely end where they begin. I called Sadie on a Sunday evening. She was in Ames finishing her senior year. I read her the numbers over the phone. There was a silence when I finished. Then she said she was glad the field held. I said I wanted to talk about the fall rotation before she came home for Thanksgiving. She was quiet for a moment. In 31 years of farming, I had not asked anyone outside my own judgment about the fall rotation. The rotation was mine. It was the expression of what I knew about this ground and what I believed it needed. To invite her into that conversation was not a small thing. We both understood that. She came home the week before Thanksgiving. We spread my yield maps and soil records alongside her legal pad and talked for 3 hours. By the end of it, we had agreed to expand the mixed stand to 120 acres for the following fall. The south field, the 2 low blocks on the west side that ran wet in April, and a strip along the creek bottom that had been my worst performing ground for the better part of a decade. June came to the table twice during those 3 hours, once to bring fresh coffee and once to sit for a while without saying anything about seeding rates or oat variety selection, because she did not need to. She was the reason the farm had stayed intact through the lean years of the late 1990s and the difficult years after her heart episode in 2017. Not through any single action, but through the steady accumulation of small decisions made without complaint, across decades of marriage to a man who did not always share the weight he was carrying. She sat at the table and listened to her daughter and her husband talk about the ground they both loved, and that was sufficient. I didn't hear from Mercer again until February of 2020. He called on a Thursday afternoon and asked if my thinking had evolved regarding the offer. I told him my thinking was my own business. He said his company remained interested and the offer could be revisited at any time. His voice carried the patient quality of a man who has learned that patience is a negotiating position. I thanked him for calling and set the phone on the workbench and went back to what I had been doing. The winter of 2020 was mild and the spring came early, and by May the expanded mixed stand blocks were showing the canopy structure Sadie had described. The oat plants filling in between the wheat stems in the lower fields. The whole stand taking on that interlocked quality that was visible even from the road if you knew what to look for. Roy drove out to the farm in the second week of May. I was in the machine shed when he pulled in. We shook hands and talked briefly about the crop insurance process from the previous fall and the new seeding rate recommendations the Extension Office had circulated for the county. Then he said he had heard I was running a mixed stand on some of the low ground. I told him he had heard right. He asked if he could walk it. We walked the south field together without saying much. Roy processes information by observing first and speaking second, which I have always respected even when I disagreed with where he landed. He walked the length of the field and crouched once to look at the base of a wheat stem where an oat plant grew 6 inches to its left. He stood back up and considered the field for a long time. He did not apologize. I did not expect him to. He said the stand looked different from what he was used to seeing. I said it was. He said he was going to have some questions for Sadie when she finished her degree. I said I would give him her number. He drove away and I stood in the field road and thought that 19 years had not made Roy Briggs a rigid man, only a certain one, and that certainty and rigidity are not the same thing, though they can look identical from the outside until something arrives that the certainty cannot account for. Sadie graduated from Iowa State in May of 2021. She took a position with an agricultural consulting firm in Ames the following month, working with farms across central Iowa on soil health and crop system design. She had clients in 4 counties by the end of her first season. She came home in the fall of 2021 and walked the expanded mixed stand blocks with me and made notes on her legal pad and told me the soil organic matter readings in the creek bottom strip were trending in the right direction. I did not tell her that Mercer had called again in October of 2021. The offer that time was $2 million, down from the high of $2,400,000 he had proposed in 2019. He framed the reduction as a reflection of updated market conditions. I read it as confirmation that someone was watching the farm closely enough to have opinions about its trajectory, and those opinions were not charitable. I said no the same way I had said no the 3 times before, without explanation and without drama. He said the offer stood. I told him he was welcome to leave it there. The spring of 2022 came in wet, not ruinously wet, no flooding, no fields that could not be planted, but persistently wet in the way that central Iowa springs sometimes arrive, with rain every 4 or 5 days from the middle of April through the first week of June. The wheat established strong and tall. The heads were heavy by late June, and the county was looking at what Roy told the farmers at the June co-op meeting was the best-looking wheat crop in 10 years. Roy was not wrong about that. The wheat was exceptional. The stems were long and the heads were full, and the test weight projections were the kind of numbers that make a man think about paying down debt ahead of schedule. I had 120 acres of mixed stand and 360 acres of pure wheat, and both were performing beautifully. And for the first time in 3 years, I sat at the kitchen table with my records and ran the numbers with something closer to confidence than calculations. Mercer called in the last week of June. His offer had come down again to $1,800,000. He did not explain the further reduction. His voice carried the same pleasant quality it always had. I ended the call before he finished the sentence. It was the first time I had done that, and it felt like the right response. The 8th of July arrived on a Tuesday. The morning was clear. The forecast was clear. The county was 2 weeks from the best wheat harvest it had seen in a decade. The sky changed in the early afternoon, not gradually, the way Iowa skies usually shift through weather with enough warning to adjust. This change had a different character. By 2 in the afternoon, the western horizon had taken on the gray-green color that experienced farmers in this part of the country learned to read the way sailors read the movement of water. By 4, the radio in the barn was broadcasting a severe thunderstorm warning for the entire central Iowa corridor. By 6, the National Weather Service had issued a Derecho watch. Every farmer in central Iowa who had been working ground for more than 20 years knew what a Derecho was. A line of severe thunderstorms moving together, producing straight-line winds that do not rotate and do not warn and do not negotiate with forecasts or crop insurance policies or combine loan payment schedules. I went inside at 6:30. June had the radio on. We ate supper without talking about it because there was nothing useful to say. The wheat was in the field, and the mixed stand was in the field, and the decisions had been made across 3 years of work, and the night was going to do what it was going to do. The storm hit Calhoun County at 9:47 in the evening. The National Weather Service station at Iowa Falls recorded sustained winds of 68 miles per hour with gusts to 81. The storm lasted 90 minutes from the time it entered the county to the time it crossed the eastern boundary. I did not go to the barn. The barn was sound and there was nothing in it that required my presence. I sat in the kitchen with June and we listened to it work. The sound of a derecho moving over flat agricultural land is unlike any other weather sound I have encountered in 31 years of farming in this county. It is not the roaring that the word storm implies. It is a sustained, low, continuous pressure, like a hand pressed flat against the roof of the world and dragged slowly south. The windows flexed. The yard light went out. The power came back after 40 minutes on the generator circuit. We sat in the kitchen until the sound stopped and then sat a little longer because the silence after a storm of that magnitude has a texture of its own, and it takes time to hear clearly what is inside it. At 11:30, I put on my jacket and went outside. The air had the clarity that follows violent weather, cold and clean and completely still. The yard was scattered with small branches, and one section of the north fence had come down where an elm had shed a major limb across it. The barn was intact. The equipment shed was intact when I got in the truck and drove to the fields. I went north first because those blocks were largest, and because some part of me needed to understand the full extent of what had happened before I allowed myself to look at the south field. What I found in the north was total. 240 acres of pure wheat, the finest stand the farm had produced in a decade, lying flat in the direction the wind had come from, every stem bent at the base, every head in contact with the soil. The headlights swept across it, and it looked like a field from which all the air had been removed. Everything compressed and still. I sat in the truck for a long time. The number forming in the back of my mind was not one I wanted to say aloud. Then I drove to the south field. I will not tell you I was not afraid of what I would find there. I had 120 acres of mixed stand in 3 separate blocks, and 3 years of decision stacked on top of each other, and a combine note that matured in December, and a man in Des Moines who had called 4 times in 3 years, and each time the offer had moved downward. I parked at the edge, got out, and turned on the flashlight I kept behind the seat. The corners were down. The edges where the field met the tree line had lodged the way they always do in high wind, because that is where air concentrates and compresses. But the interior of the field, the acreage carrying the densest oat component, the ground Earl had tried to improve in 1931, and Sadie had finally understood how to improve in 2019, was standing. Not undamaged, but standing. The stems were leaning in the direction the wind had come from, and the oat plants were pressing back against them, and the whole interlocked structure had absorbed 90 minutes of 68-mile-per-hour sustained force and returned roughly 80% of what it had been asked to hold. I walked 100 feet into the field and stood in the middle of it with the flashlight and the dark Iowa sky overhead, and I was aware of a feeling I had not felt in a long time and for which I did not have a clean name in that moment. It was something close to gratitude, for 3 words written in a margin in 1931, for a folder of papers carried home in late May of 2019, for 30 acres planted against the advice of every man in the county who thought he knew better. I drove back to the house at 1 in the morning. June was awake at the table. She looked at me when I came in. I said, "The west blocks in the creek strip held, maybe 80% standing. The north fields are gone," she said. "How bad?" I sat down and did the rough math. The north fields were looking at 60 to 70% revenue reduction at county average loss rates. The mixed stand blocks at 80% standing would come in well below their potential, but well above the county floor. The preliminary picture was that the mixed stand ground would earn somewhere between $160 and $180 per acre, while the county pure wheat average would come in somewhere near $90. June listened to all of it. Then she said, "What does that mean for December?" I told her it meant we made the payment. It would be close, but we made it. She put both hands flat on the table and looked at them for a moment. Then she said, "Your grandfather was a smart man." I said he was. I said his great-granddaughter was smarter. June did not argue with that. The calls started coming into the county extension office the following morning. Roy was at his desk by 7, and by 9 he had spoken to 32 farmers. By noon, the crop insurance adjusters in Des Moines had assigned every available agent in the central Iowa territory to Calhoun and the surrounding counties. The final tally for the county, published 6 weeks later in the Extension Service report, was a county-wide winter wheat average of 22 bushels per acre against a 5-year average of 51. Quality discounts averaging $24 per acre on the lodged grain. Net revenue per acre across the county's wheat ground of approximately $89 against a historical baseline of $201. Total estimated revenue loss for Calhoun County wheat farmers against their 5-year baseline was $4.2 million. The co-op in Rockwell City was quiet in the days after the storm in a way different from its ordinary quiet. Men came in to settle accounts and stood at the counter and did not talk much. The weather that had looked like a banner year 3 weeks earlier had become the worst production event in the county in a decade, and there was not a great deal to say that the numbers did not already say more plainly. Roy was at the counter on the Tuesday after the storm. Cooper came in that morning for a soil amendment order, and they were the only 2 people in the store for the better part of 20 minutes. Cooper had 300 acres on the north side of the county and had lost most of his pure wheat the same way everyone else had lost it. But he had put 80 acres into a mixed stand that spring after driving past the Holden South field twice during the growing season and calling Sadie in Ames to ask about seeding rates. Those 80 acres had come through the derecho at 70% standing. His blended revenue on that ground was going to be roughly double the county average. Cooper did not raise the subject to make a point. He was not that kind of man. He raised it because Roy was the extension agent for the county, and the information seemed relevant to whatever Roy was going to say to 47 farm families in the coming weeks. He said, "Roy, I put 80 acres in mixed stand this spring. Followed the Holden approach. It came through at 70% standing." Roy looked at him. Cooper said, "I called Walt's daughter in April and asked about seeding rates. She walked me through the whole thing over the phone. 45 minutes, never charged a cent." Roy said, "I know. I've been hearing about your ground since Wednesday morning," Cooper said. "She told me in May of 2019 that this was worth trying. You were standing right there." The store was quiet. Roy looked at his hands on the counter. He was a methodical man processing something methodically, and Cooper had enough patience to wait for him to finish. Roy said, "I was standing right there." He said it the way a man says something he has been carrying for 3 years and has finally located the right words for, not as a confession, as a fact, the kind of fact that, once stated plainly, cannot be taken back. He said he was going to drive to Ames when the harvest was settled. Mercer called on the 15th of July, 1 week after the derecho. His voice carried the same pleasant quality it always had, but there was something beneath it that had not been there before. A slight compression around the edges of his words that a man recognizes when another man is doing arithmetic in real time. The offer was $1,600,000. He said market conditions continued to evolve and that the derecho had created significant uncertainty across central Iowa agricultural land values, and that his company was positioned to support producers who needed liquidity in the near term. He said he hoped the Holden operation was holding up. He said it with warmth that was indistinguishable from calculation. I listened to the whole call this time. I let him finish and I waited 2 seconds and I said, "Gerald, I have taken 4 calls from you in 3 years. Every time you have called, the number has come down. A man might draw conclusions from that about what your company actually believes this land is worth." Mercer was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Mr. Holden, I think you are a practical man. The situation in the county right now is difficult. I'm simply trying to make sure you have options." I said, "I have the option I need. Thank you for calling." I set the phone on the workbench. I walked to the doorway of the machine shed and looked across the farm road at the north field still lying flat in the July heat. and I thought about what the word options meant to a man like Mercer and what it meant to a man like me. Mercer's options were financial instruments. Mine was 120 acres of mixed grain that had held together through 81-mile-per-hour gusts, while $4.2 million of his expectations for this county came apart around it. The harvest ran through the second week of August. Les Pruitt ran the combine through the lodged north fields at low speed for 4 days, and the grain came in the way lodged grain always does, below weight, above moisture, carrying the smell of a crop that has been through more than it was built to handle. The elevator discounts were substantial. The final numbers on the pure wheat ground were worse than my preliminary estimate. Not dramatically worse, but worse in the particular way. Farm math is always worse when you sit down with the final receipts. The mixed stand ground came in on the last 2 days of harvest. 120 acres of wheat and oats processed separately. The Cedar Rapids buyer sending a truck for the oats on the final day. The blended revenue came to $178 per acre, against the county's $89 average. The mixed stand ground had earned exactly twice as much. Against the 5-year baseline of $201, it had given up some ground, but it had not been broken. There is a difference, in farming, between a year that is hard and a year that requires a conversation with the bank about what comes next. The mixed stand had kept me on the right side of that line. I called Sadie when the final numbers were in. She was at her desk in Ames. I read her the figures straight through without commentary. When I finished, there was a silence. Then she asked about December. I told her we made the payment. The mixed stand revenue on 120 acres, combined with what I had set aside across the 2 seasons since the 2019 storm, covered the final installment on the combine note with $4,000 remaining. The equipment was ours. The farm was ours. Gerald Mercer had called 4 times in 3 years, and the answer had been no 4 times, and the reason to say yes had not materialized in the way he had calculated it would. Sadie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What happened to the farms that did not try it?" I told her what I knew. 14 farms in the county were in active conversations with their lenders about restructuring. 3 had received formal notices. Cooper had heard from a neighbor on the north side that an agricultural land acquisition company was circling the county making offers on distressed properties. Sadie said, "What is the company called?" I told her. There was a pause. Then she said, "Papa, I need to make some calls. Can we talk tomorrow?" I said we could. I asked what she was thinking. She said she was not ready to say yet. She wanted to be sure before she said anything. That was something she had gotten from her mother, the habit of being certain before speaking. And it was one of the things about her that had made me trust the manila folder she placed on the kitchen table in the spring of 2019. I said, "Take your time." She said, "I will." She said, "Papa, you made the payment." I said, "Yes." She said, "Good." We hung up. I went inside. June was in the kitchen. She looked at me the way she had looked at me for 33 years of marriage, like a woman who already knew most of what she was about to be told and was waiting to see which part I would choose to say aloud. I told her the payment was covered. She said, "I know." I asked how she knew. She said, "Because your grandfather planted this land in 1923, and he knew what he was doing even when he didn't know how to do it yet. And that runs in your family." Walt? Whether you admit it or not, I sat at the kitchen table. The harvest records were stacked at one end. Earl's notebook was on the shelf where Sadie had placed it. The oak desk in the living room had an empty top left drawer for the first time in 4 years. Outside, the north fields were stripped and bare in the August heat. In the south field and the west blocks and the creek bottom strip, the ground that had held through 2 storms in 3 years was already beginning to settle back into itself. The stems breaking down, the oat straw working into the surface, the soil doing what good soil does when it has finally been given what it needed. 3 days after that phone call, Sadie drove home from Ames with her legal pad and a new folder and something different in her expression. Not the restless urgency of a young woman with data to present. Something quieter, something that looked more like purpose than argument. She sat at the kitchen table and said, "I need to tell you both something about Apex AgriCorp." June came from the kitchen and sat across from her. I sat at the end of the table between them. Sadie opened the folder. What it contained was not research papers or seeding rate tables or anything resembling the materials she had been bringing to that table since the summer of 2019. It was a map of Calhoun County printed from a land records database, with 14 properties marked in red ink, and beside each property a sale price recorded in the county assessor's office, and beside each sale price a date. She spread the map between us and said nothing for a moment. She let us look. June put on her reading glasses. I leaned forward. The 14 properties were distributed across the county in a pattern that was not random. They clustered around the lowest lying ground, the fields with the most consistent lodging history. The farms the Extension Service yield records would show had performed below county average in 3 of the last 6 seasons. Every sale had closed within 4 months of a significant weather event. The prices ran between 16 and 22% below assessed fair market value for comparable agricultural land in the county. I looked at the dates. The earliest sale was 2015. The most recent was the previous November, 4 months after a late frost event that had cut yields on the affected properties by 30%. Sadie said. Cooper found the first 3. He noticed that 2 of his neighbors had sold to the same buyer within 6 weeks of each other after the 2020 season. The buyer in both cases was a landholding company registered in Delaware called Meridian Farmland Partners. He looked up the registration. Meridian Farmland Partners is a wholly owned subsidiary of Apex AgriCorp, June said. The same company Gerald Mercer represents. Sadie said yes. Cooper had spent the better part of 4 months pulling land records. 14 sales in Calhoun County, 11 more in Hamilton County to the east, and 9 in Webster County to the north. 34 properties across 3 counties, all sold to Apex subsidiaries, all sold within a short window after a weather or market stress event, all sold at prices measurably below what a patient seller in a stable year would have accepted. I said, buying distressed land at below market prices is not illegal. Sadie said, no. She turned to the second page. She said, this might be. The second page was a document Cooper had obtained through a public records request to the Iowa Secretary of State's office, a filing made by Apex AgriCorp's Iowa Regional Division in 2019, describing their acquisition strategy for central Iowa agricultural land. The filing was routine, the kind of corporate disclosure that exists in a database and is never read by anyone without a specific reason to look for it. Cooper had a specific reason. The filing described a strategy Apex called opportunistic agricultural consolidation. It outlined a methodology for identifying properties with elevated financial vulnerability, defined as farms carrying debt service above 40% of gross revenue in the prior 2 seasons, and prioritizing outreach to those properties in the 6-month window following a significant crop loss event. The document used the phrase relationship development to describe the process of making repeated contact with targeted landowners over multiple years to establish trust before a distressed sale opportunity arose. Relationship development. I sat with those 2 words. 4 calls in 3 years. A voice that never changed its pleasant, unhurried quality regardless of how many times the answer was no. A man who drove 40 miles and stood in my gravel drive in clean boots and said he hoped my operation was holding up. June said quietly, he was counting on the storm. Sadie said, not a specific storm. The model works with any stress event, drought, late frost, pest pressure, market collapse. They watch for whatever comes and move quickly when it does and stay patient in between. The 14 sales in this county represent approximately 6,000 acres. At current agricultural land values in central Iowa, that portfolio is worth somewhere between $18 and $22 million. They paid, in aggregate, about $14 million for it. I looked at the map again. The red marks clustered around the low ground. I thought about a man sitting in a Des Moines office in 2018, looking at a database of Calhoun County farm debt and identifying the Holden operation. 480 acres with a new combine loan and a 5-year lodging history on the South Blocks, as a property worth developing a relationship with. I thought about what this farm looked like on a spreadsheet to someone who had never walked the ground and did not know about a leather notebook from 1923 or a 21-year-old woman with a legal pad full of correct data. On a spreadsheet, the Holden farm in the fall of 2018 looked like a farm that was going to need to sell. I said, what does Cooper want to do with this? Sadie said, he has already done part of it. He filed the land records documentation with the Iowa Attorney General's office 2 weeks ago. A staff attorney in the Consumer Protection Division made contact with him last week. They are looking at whether the pattern of activity meets the threshold for an investigation into predatory land acquisition practices under Iowa agricultural land protection statutes. I said, that is a slow process. She said yes, but there is a faster one. Roy Briggs is presenting at the Iowa Extension Annual Conference in Des Moines in March. He had asked her to co-present. The presentation would cover mixed stand management data from 3 counties, the 2019 and 2022 storm results, and the broader question of what crop system diversification means for farm financial resilience in central Iowa. She believed the Apex material should be part of that presentation, not as accusation, as context. As the reason why the question of financial resilience was not abstract, I looked at her across the table. She was 24 years old, and she had spent 5 years moving toward a moment she had not known was coming when she packed her bag and came home in the spring of 2019 with a folder full of papers about oats. I said, "Does Roy know about the Apex material?" She said she had sent it to him that morning. He called back in 40 minutes. He was not surprised. He had known properties in the county were being acquired but had not connected the pattern the way Cooper connected it. He had been quiet on the phone for a long time after she walked him through the filing, and then he had said one thing. I asked what he said. She said, "He told me he should have listened to me in May of 2019, not because of the oats, because I was the kind of person who pays attention to things other people overlook, and he decided who I was mattered less than how old I was, and he was wrong about that." The kitchen was quiet. June took off her reading glasses and set them on the table. Outside, the August evening was settling over the farm in the amber light that comes in late summer when the days are beginning to shorten but have not yet fully given into it. I could see the north fields through the window, stripped and bare, and beyond them the tree line along the creek that marked the edge of the south field. I said, "Tell Roy we will both be in Des Moines in March." Sadie looked at me. She said, "You have never been to an extension conference." I said, "I have not had a reason before." The shape of what Roy said in Ames I know from what Sadie described to me that evening on the phone, and from knowing Roy Briggs well enough across 23 years to hear the manner of a man in the version someone else gives you. He drove to her consulting office on a morning in the second week of September. He arrived with a notepad and a list of questions, and the particular bearing of a man who has been working through something difficult and private and has finally arrived at the place where the difficulty requires another person. He sat across from her in a small conference room and said he had 47 farm families in this county. Most of them had lost between a quarter and a third of their wheat revenue that year. He had spent 6 weeks sitting across kitchen tables from men and women who had done everything the way they were supposed to do it and still ended up in conversations with their banks they had not expected to be having. And he was the person who had told them how to farm. He had told them for 19 years, and he needed to understand what he had not been telling them. She said, "What do you want to understand?" he said. "I want to understand the difference between a system that has worked and a system that will hold." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "The farms that put in mixed stands in 2020 and 2021 came through the derecho at roughly twice the revenue of the county average. The farms that looked at those results in 2020 and decided to wait because that year was mild and the pure wheat did fine, those are the ones calling the crop insurance adjusters right now. A mild year looks identical from the outside whether your system is sound or whether you have simply been fortunate. The derecho reveals the difference. The problem is that you only get to take that test once." Roy wrote that down. She said, "The lesson is not that oats are better than wheat. The lesson is that any operation built entirely around a single crop is an operation that requires only one catastrophic season to become someone else's opportunity." She said that last word carefully and watched his face when she said it. He looked up from the notepad. He said, "The Apex material you sent me?" She said, "Yes." He said, "How many families in the county do you think are in their target range right now?" She said, "Based on Cooper's analysis and the debt service thresholds in Apex's own filing, probably 11, maybe 13. Mercer or someone like him would be making contact within the next 2 to 4 months if the pattern held." Roy set his pen on the notepad. He said, "I need to present this at the conference. Not as alarm, as information. Farmers in this county deserve to know that there is a company in Des Moines with a spreadsheet that has their name on it." Sadie said, "I know. That is why I sent it to you." Roy picked up his pen again. He said, "I told you in 2019 that this county had never needed oats to hold up its wheat." He said it without looking up from the notepad. He said, I was describing the past and presenting it as a prediction. Those are not the same thing, and I am old enough to have known the difference. She said, "You were presenting it at the conference in March." He said, "Yes." She said, "Then say it there. Say it where the people who need to hear it are sitting in the room." The Iowa Extension Annual Conference was held in Des Moines on the 14th of March 2023. 312 people attended the morning session. Roy presented in the second slot, 45 minutes on mixed stand winter wheat management in central Iowa with data from Calhoun, Hamilton, and Webster counties covering the 2019 through 2022 growing seasons. Sadie sat in the fourth row. I sat beside her. June had wanted to come, and I had told her the drive was long and the conference was long, and she had told me she had been to plenty of long things in her life, and she was coming. She sat on the other side of Sadie in the good coat she wore to things that mattered. In the third row, 2 seats to the left, a man in a gray suit was taking notes on a legal pad. I didn't know him. Cooper, sitting 1 row behind us, leaned forward and said quietly that the man was a senior associate from an agricultural land investment firm based in Chicago, affiliated with Apex AgriCorp. He had registered for the conference under a consulting company name that did not appear in any Iowa business registry Cooper could find. I looked at the man in the gray suit. He was perhaps 40, careful the way lawyers are careful, writing without looking at his hand. He had the quality of a person who attends events to observe rather than to participate, and he was observing Roy Briggs the way you observe something you have not yet decided whether to be concerned about. And Roy stood at the front of the room and walked through the storm data from October 2019. He walked through the 2020 adoption results. He walked through the 2022 derecho and the county revenue figures and the performance differential between the mixed stand acreage and the pure wheat ground. He presented all of it clearly and without drama, the way extension agents present information, as fact, with sources cited and margins noted. Then he stopped. He said, "Before I close this section, I want to acknowledge something that does not usually get acknowledged at a conference like this." In May of 2019, a 21-year-old agronomy student from Iowa State University came into the Calhoun County Co-op with a legal pad full of correct data and told me that mixed winter wheat and oat stands would reduce lodging risk on low ground and improve financial resilience for farms in my county. I told her she was going to confuse her combine operator, cut her yield, and spend harvest time explaining herself to her father. The room was quiet, and he said, she planted 30 acres on the lowest ground of her family farm. The October storm that year put the rest of the county on the ground. Her 30 acres held. She expanded to 120 acres. The July derecho 2 years ago put the rest of the county down again. Her 120 acres came through at twice the county revenue average. Her father made his final combine payment in December of 2022 without restructuring. That farm is still in the Holden family. He said, "The work that underpins everything I am presenting today began in a co-op in Rockwell City when I was standing at a counter and a young woman was standing across from me, and I was wrong, and she was right, and I didn't know it yet. Her name is Sadie Holden, and she is in this room." He did not gesture toward the fourth row. He did not ask her to stand. He said her name and let it sit in the room and moved to the next slide. I felt Sadie go very still beside me. June reached across and put her hand on our daughter's arm for a moment and then took it away. I looked straight ahead at the projection screen. I was not going to be the person who made that moment larger than Roy had made it, because Roy had made it exactly the right size, and anything I added would have diminished it. The man in the gray suit in the third row had stopped writing. Beside. Roy spent the final 12 minutes on the Apex AgriCorp material. He did not call it predatory. He did not use language that would give a Chicago law firm anything to work with. He presented the data Cooper had assembled as a pattern of land acquisition activity in 3 central Iowa counties, showed the correlation between weather stress events and acquisition timing, cited the language from Apex's own 2019 Iowa filing, and said that farmers in the affected counties should be aware that the pattern existed and that resources were available through the Iowa Attorney General's office for anyone who felt their situation warranted inquiry. He said, "I'm not here to tell any farmer what to do with an offer they receive. I'm here to tell you that the offer you receive after a hard season may not be arriving by coincidence." He said, "Information is a tool, the same as a legal pad, the same as a notebook from 1923. Use what you have. After the session ended and the room broke into the corridor conversation that follows every conference presentation, Cooper made his way to where the man in the gray suit had been sitting. The seat was empty. The man had left during the final minutes of the presentation, quietly, the way people leave rooms when a room has become uncomfortable for them. Cooper told me about it that afternoon in the hotel corridor. He said, he was gone before Roy finished. I said, "Good," Cooper said. "The Attorney General's office called me last week. They have opened a formal inquiry into Apex AgriCorp's acquisition activity in central Iowa. Mercer has been asked to provide documentation of his outreach methodology for 14 specific properties in Calhoun County. I asked how long that process took. Cooper said, "Months, maybe longer. It will not be fast and it will not be loud and it probably will not end with anyone going to prison. But the inquiry is public record now. Any farmer in the county who searches Apex AgriCorp in Iowa is going to find it, and Mercer's name is in the filing." I said, "That is enough." Cooper looked at me. He said, "Walt, he called you 4 times in 3 years and every time the offer went down?" I said, "I know." He said, "He was counting on you to break. He had a model that said you would." I said, "My grandfather built a model in 1923 that said the South Field could hold if you understood how to plant it. It took 3 generations to work out the science. Gerald Mercer had 3 years in a spreadsheet and he was working with the wrong data." Cooper was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Can I ask you something?" I said he could. He said, "The night of the derecho, when you drove out and saw the North Fields, did you think about the offer?" I looked at him. He was 34 years old and he had 300 acres on the north side of the county, and he had lost most of his pure wheat that night, and had also protected 80 acres of mixed stand because he had driven past the South Field twice during the growing season and made a phone call. He was not asking to judge me. He was asking because he wanted to know what it felt like to be in that truck on that road with that knowledge and that number in your head. I said, "I thought about it for about 30 seconds. I thought about what $2 million would have meant for June and for Sadie and for the note at the bank. Then I drove to the South Field and I got out of the truck and I turned on the flashlight and I saw the oat plants holding the wheat stems and I stopped thinking about it." He nodded slowly. I said, "The money was never the point for Mercer. The point was the land. He wanted what 3 generations of my family built. The money was just the mechanism. You do not give up the thing that matters because the mechanism has gotten difficult." Sadie found us in the corridor 20 minutes later. She had been stopped by 4 people coming out of the session room, farmers from Hamilton and Webster counties, with questions about seeding rates and oat variety selection and the Cedar Rapids buyer. She had her legal pad out and was writing as she walked. She looked at me and said, "I have 6 new clients." I said, "I'm not surprised, She said, "Roy wants to do a field day at the farm this summer. Bring producers from all 3 counties. Walk the blocks, show the soil data, go through the 2019 and 2022 numbers on the ground where it happened." I said, "Tell Roy he is welcome at the farm anytime he wants to come." She said, "I already told him that." June, who had been standing slightly apart from the 3 of us, with the patience of a woman who has spent 3 decades watching the people she loves reach conclusions she arrived at earlier and more quietly, said, "Invite him for dinner when he comes. He has a long drive from Rockwell City." Sadie said she would. I said, "Your mother is right. The least we can do is feed the man." June said, "It is not the least we can do. It is the appropriate thing to do for someone who drove to Ames and sat in a conference room and told 300 people he was wrong." That is the thing about June that I have never found words adequate for in 33 years of being married to her. She does not reach for the large statement. She finds the precise word for what is true and says it plainly and stops, and the plainness of it is what gives it weight. Roy Briggs was wrong. He acknowledged it in a room full of his peers without being asked to, without softening it, without reaching for the qualified language that makes an acknowledgement sound like something other than what it is. That deserved a dinner. The field day happened in July of 2023, 4 weeks after the wheat harvest came off the Holden farm. 51 farmers attended from Calhoun, Hamilton, and Webster counties. Roy organized the logistics. Sadie prepared the presentation materials. I spent 3 days mowing the field roads and cleaning the equipment shed because I was not going to have 50 people walking my ground with the place looking like it had been through a hard year. Even though it had been through a hard year. because there is a difference between a farm that has been through hard weather and a farm that has not been tended. The field day started at 8 in the morning at the south field. Sadie walked the group through the mixed stand blocks, pointing to the ground structure, explaining the oat root network and its effect on soil aggregation, showing the soil sample data from the creek bottom strip where 3 years of oat straw incorporation had measurably improved organic matter content in what had been the worst performing soil on the farm. She spoke without notes. She had been living inside this data for 4 years, and it came out of her the way knowledge comes out of people who have not merely studied something, but have watched it prove itself in real conditions on ground. They knew before they knew how to explain what they were seeing. Roy stood at the back of the group. He had decided before the field day that this was Sadie's morning and that his role was to listen and to be seen listening, which is a different thing from having nothing to say and a harder thing for a man of his experience to carry off convincingly. He carried it off. Several of the older farmers in the group noticed it. You do not reach a certain age without developing an eye for the difference between a man who has stepped back by choice and a man who has been pushed. Cooper walked beside a farmer named Isaac Whitmore from Webster County who had lost 40% of his wheat acreage in the derecho and was asking careful questions about seeding rate adjustments for heavier clay soils. Cooper answered what he could from his own experience and directed the rest towards Sadie, who circled back twice during the walk to address Whitmore's specific situation. After the field walk, I brought the group to the equipment shed for the numbers presentation. Sadie put the yield data on a whiteboard borrowed from the extension office in Rockwell City. The 2019 results, the 2020 expansion, the 2022 Derecho comparison, county average versus mixed stand ground, acre by acre and year by year, with the final column showing cumulative revenue difference across 3 seasons. The room was quiet while she talked, not the quiet of skepticism, the quiet of people doing arithmetic against their own situations and arriving at conclusions they had not expected to reach that morning when they drove to the Holden farm. At the end of the presentation, a farmer from Hamilton County named Dale Carver, who had been farming the west side of that county for 26 years and had said almost nothing during the entire morning, raised his hand. He said, "What stopped you from walking away from this after the first year?" The 2020 season was mild. The mixed stand came in below the pure wheat. A lot of people would have concluded the experiment had run its course. Sadie looked at him. She said, "My great-grandfather tried this in 1931 and failed because he did not have the seeding rate data. He wrote 3 words in a notebook and stopped. He did not know that stopping was the wrong decision because no one had given him a reason to know it yet. I knew why he had failed and what he had been missing. So when 2020 came in mild and the pure wheat outperformed the mix, I already understood that a mild year was not the test. I knew what the test looked like. I was waiting for it." Dale Carver nodded. He said, "The notebook Roy mentioned at the conference in March. Is that the one your great-grandfather wrote?" Sadie said yes. He said, "Can I see it?" I went inside and brought it out. Dale Carver held it in both hands the way you hold something belonging to a specific weight of time. He turned to page 37. He read the entry. He read the 3 words in the margin. He stood there in the equipment shed with the notebook open and 50 farmers behind him, and the shed was quiet in a way that rooms get quiet when something real is being understood rather than simply heard. He said, "Right idea, wrong knowledge." He said it to himself, but the shed was quiet enough that everyone present heard it. He handed the notebook back to me. He said, "I'm going to put 80 acres in mixed stand this fall." He said, "I should have been here 4 years ago." I said, "You are here now." By the fall of 2023, 29 farms across Calhoun, Hamilton, and Webster counties had planted portions of their acreage in mixed winter wheat and oat stands, representing just over 4,000 acres. The methodology Sadie had developed across 3 seasons on the Holden ground, adjusted for soil type variations by county, was published as a guidance document through the Iowa State Extension Service in October, with Roy Briggs and Dr. Paul Hendricks from Iowa State listed as authors and Sadie listed as primary field contributor. In November, the Iowa Attorney General's office announced the completion of its inquiry into Apex AgriCorp's Central Iowa land acquisition activity. The inquiry found sufficient evidence of a coordinated pattern of contact with financially vulnerable producers, timed to post-loss events, to warrant referral to the State Agricultural Land Protection Division for formal review. Apex Agricorp was required to submit documentation of all contact activity with Calhoun, Hamilton, and Webster County landowners going back to 2015. 2 of the 14 properties acquired in Calhoun County were identified as having been purchased under circumstances the review board found inconsistent with fair dealing standards under Iowa agricultural statute, and Apex was required to offer right of first refusal to the original selling families at current market value. Gerald Mercer's name appeared in the inquiry findings as the regional director responsible for the outreach program. He was not charged with a crime. He did not go to prison. He left his position at Apex Agricorp in December of 2023, a fact reported in 3 sentences in the Des Moines Business Journal that most people in Calhoun County did not read. The people in Calhoun County who needed to know it found out through Cooper Vance, who had been watching the inquiry closely enough to know when it resolved and who passed the information to the farmers. He knew the same way he had been sharing information since the night he drove past the Southfield after the 2019 storm and decided that what he saw there was worth paying attention to. The Holden Farm went into the 2024 season with 200 acres of mixed stand, expanded in stages from the original 30, and 280 acres of pure wheat on the highest and best drained ground where the lodging risk was lowest and the case for diversification was weakest. That is the honest way to manage a mixed system, not by applying the principle everywhere because the principle is sound, but by applying it where the ground and the risk profile make it the right answer and leaving it off where they do not. Sadie came home for Thanksgiving that year. She was 26 years old and had 40 farm clients across 4 counties and a truck with more miles on it than she sometimes wanted to count. She came in on a Wednesday evening and set her bag in the hallway and came into the kitchen where June was finishing dinner, and I was at the table with the yield records from the fall in front of me. She sat across from me and looked at the records. Then she looked at me. She said, "I've been reading about cover crop integration with winter wheat. Crimson clover underseeded at heading, terminated before harvest. It adds nitrogen, improves organic matter in the subsoil layers. And the preliminary data from a Missouri trial suggests it reduces synthetic nitrogen input costs enough to offset the establishment cost within 2 seasons. There is a field day at the University of Missouri in February. I think we should go." I looked at her across the table. She had her legal pad with her. She always had her legal pad. The handwriting on it now was her own data from her own clients across 4 counties, things she had measured and recorded and turned into conclusions that other people trusted enough to plant on. I reached to the shelf beside the table and took down Earl's notebook. Then I went to the oak desk and opened the top left drawer and took out the letter from the bank with the number 280,000 printed inside it and the stamp across the front that read, "Paid in full," dated December 19th, 2022. I set them both on the table between us. I said, "Your great-grandfather tried something that did not work in 1931. He wrote 3 words and stopped. He didn't know what he was missing. You came home in 2019 with what he was missing. You planted it on the worst 30 acres of this farm, and you waited for the weather to tell you if you were right. You were right. This letter exists because you were right." Sadie looked at the notebook and at the letter and did not say anything. She is not a person who fills silences with words when the silence is already carrying something. I said, "Tell me about the crimson clover." Something moved in her face in that moment that I am not going to try to describe at length because some things are better held than explained. She opened the legal pad. June came to the doorway of the kitchen and stood there a moment, watching the 2 of us at the table with the notebook and the paid letter and the legal pad between us. And then she went back without saying anything, and that was exactly right. We sat at the table for 3 hours. Earl's notebook was open at one end. The paid letter was beside it. The legal pad was in the middle, covered in Sadie's handwriting. And the coffee went cold the way it always does when the conversation is more important than what is in the cup. Outside, the 200 acres of mixed stand ground was settling into its winter dormancy. The oat straw breaking down into the surface of the creek bottom and the west blocks and the south field that Earl had tried to improve in 1931, and Raymond had farmed without improvement for 30 years, and I had farmed without improvement for 30 more. The ground was doing what good ground does when it has finally been given what it needs, working quietly, building toward something, getting better in ways that do not announce themselves. My grandfather wrote 3 words in a notebook and stopped. His great-granddaughter came home 60 years later with the science to finish what he started. and the south field is still standing.